The portal tore open with a sound like reality ripping at its seams, a jagged wound of shimmering violet light that spat Leon out onto cracked asphalt. He stumbled forward, his boots, scarred leather from some long-dead demon beast, scuffing against the ground. For a moment, he just breathed, the air tasting of gasoline and damp concrete instead of brimstone and blood. 1,000 years. 1,000 years of screaming, of fighting through layers of hell where demons wore the faces of forgotten gods, and here he was, back on Earth. His body ached with the memory of it all, the latticework of silvery scars across his forearms, the deep gouge along his ribs that never fully healed, the phantom pain in his left shoulder where a shadow beast had nearly torn his arm off. He wore simple, durable clothes, dark pants, a worn jacket, but they couldn't hide the way he moved, every step deliberate, every glance assessing threats that weren't there anymore. Or so he'd thought. He stood in an alley, narrow and grimy, wedged between two brick buildings that loomed like tired sentinels. Graffiti splashed the walls in faded blues and reds, messages he couldn't parse. A dumpster overflowed with black bags, leaking something sour. The sky above was a bruised twilight, streaked with clouds that didn't quite look right, their edges too sharp, their movement stuttering. Leon frowned, his system interface flickering at the edge of his vision, a translucent overlay he'd honed in hell. It usually displayed combat logs, skill trees, inventory slots. Now, it glitched, pixels dancing erratically. He willed it to stabilize, and it did, but something was off. The air itself felt, textured, like he was walking through a story someone else was writing. Then he saw it. A street lamp at the alley's mouth, its bulb encased in a rusty cage, flickered. Not the normal sputter of dying electricity, but a rhythmic pulse, on-off, and with each flicker, text scrawled across the air around it. Glowing green glyphs, shimmering like heat haze, arranged in lines that reminded him of programming code. Rule strings. The term surfaced from his system's memory banks, a concept he'd encountered in hell's deeper layers, where reality sometimes bent to arcane laws. But this was Earth. This shouldn't be here. He approached cautiously, his combat instincts screaming, though no enemy manifested. The rule string hung in the air, visible only through his interface. He focused, and it resolved into clear, chilling words, rule string number 001, urban light anomaly. If a humanoid entity stands directly beneath this light source for a continuous duration of 60 seconds while in a state of solitude, said entity shall undergo instantaneous spatial displacement to an undetermined non-local coordinate. Compliance enforced by narrative subroutine gamma. Leon's breath caught. Spatial displacement. Vanish. This wasn't just a glitch, it was a rule, a deadly one, woven into the fabric of this place. His neighborhood, he recognized this alley, near his old apartment building. People lived here. Walked here. How many had broken this unknowable taboo? He thought of his neighbors, faces blurred by time but not by feeling, Mrs. Gable with her terrier, the college student who always nodded hello. Were they gone? Swallowed by rules they couldn't see? Anger, cold and sharp, cut through his weariness. He hadn't survived hell to come home to this. His system interface hummed, responding to his intent. In hell, it had evolved beyond mere stat tracking, it could interact with dimensional layers, parse magical constructs. Here, it seemed attuned to these rule strings. A new submenu flickered into view, string manipulation protocol. Options glowed, view, edit, overwrite, delete. Delete was grayed out, inaccessible. Too much strain, the system warned in a soft chime. But edit. He selected it. The rule string expanded, its code-like structure revealing editable fields. The cost displayed, system strain, minor. Temporary depletion of interface stability for 2 to 3 minutes. Proceed. Leon didn't hesitate. He focused on the consequence clause, undergo instantaneous spatial displacement. His fingers, calloused from gripping sword hilts, moved through the air, manipulating the string as if it were tangible. He rewrote it, carefully, his mind working with the precision of a surgeon. He changed spatial displacement to an undetermined non-local coordinate to receive 1 physical coupon redeemable for a free large pizza at Giovanni's Pizzeria, valid for 30 days. The string glitched violently, green pixels scattering like startled insects. A low hum vibrated through the alley, and Leon felt a tug at his core, a draining sensation as if part of his energy was siphoned into the edit. The system interface flickered, its menus becoming translucent for a moment. But it held. The new rule string settled into place. If a humanoid entity stands directly beneath this light source for a continuous duration of 60 seconds while in a state of solitude, said entity shall receive 1 physical coupon redeemable for a free large pizza at Giovanni's Pizzeria, valid for 30 days. Compliance enforced by narrative subroutine Gamma. Leon let out a slow breath. Minor strain, as predicted. A headache throbbed behind his eyes, but it was manageable. He watched the street lamp, its flickering ceased, the light steadying into a warm, ordinary glow. No text shimmered around it now. He'd hacked it. Neutered it. The absurdity hit him, a cosmic horror rule turned into a pizza giveaway. A faint, grim smile touched his lips. This was his strength now, not swinging a blade through demon hordes, but bending the rules that bound this broken world. He took a step back, scanning the alley. His system interface began to stabilize, the glitches fading. He needed to get to his apartment, see what remained, understand the scope of this infestation. As he turned to leave, a prickle crawled up his spine, the old hell instinct, the sense of being watched. He froze, every muscle coiled. His eyes lifted, sweeping the rooftops. There, on the edge of a 4-story building to his left, a shadow detached itself from the chimney stack. It was humanoid in shape but wrong, its silhouette blurring at the edges as if reality couldn't decide how to render it. And eyes, too many eyes, glinting like polished obsidian in the twilight, arranged in no pattern he could discern. They fixed on him. The figure didn't move, just watched, its form flickering with aggressive, red-hued rule strings that scrolled through the air around it. Leon's interface zoomed in, parsing them automatically, entity designation, observer class enforcer. Directive, monitor narrative compliance. Alert, loophole user detected at coordinates 40.7128 degrees north, 74.0060 degrees west, initiate observation protocol. Priority, high. Do not engage, report to higher authority. The words hung in the air, a silent threat. Leon met its gaze, his own eyes hard. He didn't flinch, didn't run. After a millennium in hell, a watcher on a rooftop was almost mundane. Almost. But this was different, this thing was part of the system, an enforcer of the very rules he'd just manipulated. And it had seen him. It knew what he was. A loophole user. The term echoed in his mind. He'd drawn attention on his first minutes back. The figure remained motionless, a sentinel of glitching code and too many eyes, as Leon slowly, deliberately, walked out of the alley and into the street beyond, the weight of its stare following him like a second shadow. The alley's grime still clung to Leon's clothes as he walked the familiar streets of his old neighborhood. 1,000 years had passed in hell, but here, only a few decades had slipped by, yet everything felt wrong. The buildings stood where he remembered them, the same cracked sidewalks, the same faded storefronts, but the air hummed with a wrongness that made his skin prickle. His system interface flickered at the edge of his vision, a persistent ghost from his time in the demon realms, now evolved into something both familiar and alien. He passed a playground where children should have been laughing. Instead, it stood empty, the swings moving gently in a breeze that carried no sound. A rule string glitched into view above the slide, any child who slides down backwards will become part of the wood. The text shimmered with a sickly green light before fading. Leon's interface automatically logged it, adding it to the growing database of horrors that had overwritten his home. He didn't bother hacking this one, no children were here to break it, and his system strain from the street lamp incident still lingered as a dull ache behind his eyes. His apartment building loomed ahead, a 5-story brick structure that had once been home. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking on hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. Inside, the lobby was dim, the fluorescent lights flickering in a pattern that made his interface twitch. Another rule string appeared, standing in darkness for 47 seconds summons the Shadow Walker. Leon noted it and moved quickly through the patch of shadow near the mailboxes, counting silently. 46 seconds later, he was at the stairs, the shadow behind him remaining empty. The climb to the 3rd floor felt longer than he remembered. Each step groaned under his weight, and halfway up, a rule string materialized on the wall, the 3rd stair from the top creaks with the voice of the forgotten. Leon paused, his interface analyzing the string. He could hack it, turn it into something harmless, like the pizza coupon he'd created earlier, but the system strain warning flashed again. Better to conserve his energy. He stepped over the third stair entirely, his muscles remembering millennia of battlefield precision. Apartment 3B. His old door. The number was tarnished, and someone had scratched something into the wood, a series of symbols that made no sense until his interface translated them: do not knock after sunset. It was daytime, barely, with weak sunlight filtering through the grimy window at the end of the hall. Leon raised his hand, hesitated, then knocked 3 times. Silence. Then a shuffling sound, like someone dragging themselves across the floor. The door cracked open, revealing a single bloodshot eye. "Go away," a voice whispered, hoarse with fear. "It's Tuesday." Leon pushed the door open gently, his strength making the resistance negligible. The man inside stumbled back, a thin figure in rumpled pajamas, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and trembling hands. The apartment was a mess, furniture overturned, food rotting on counters, and every window covered with thick blankets. The air smelled of sweat and decay. "I used to live here," Leon said, his voice calm. He kept his movements slow, non-threatening. The man's eyes darted around the room as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," the man whispered, his gaze fixed on a clock on the wall. It read 2:47 p.m. "Tuesdays, the faceless man comes. If you look at him." He trailed off, wrapping his arms around himself. "Mrs. Gable from 2C looked last week. She's gone. Just, gone." Leon's interface pinged softly. Entity profile updated, faceless man. Data incomplete. He focused on the man. "What's your name?" "Henry," the man said after a moment. "Henry Miller. I moved in after everything changed. The previous tenant vanished on a Tuesday too." He pointed a shaking finger at the clock. "He comes at 3 p.m. every Tuesday. You have to leave. If you see him." Leon didn't leave. He walked to the window, peeling back a corner of the blanket. The street below was deserted, save for a stray cat that froze mid-step, then vanished in a glitch of static. His interface logged it: stray animals that pause for 10 seconds are erased. The system strain from earlier pulsed again, a reminder that his power wasn't infinite. He'd need to be careful. "How long has this been happening?" Leon asked, turning back to Henry. "Months. Maybe a year." Time doesn't work right anymore," Henry said, sinking onto a couch that smelled of mildew. "There are rules. Everyone whispers about them. Don't stand under street lamps too long. Don't answer the phone if it rings 3 times. Don't look at the faceless man on Tuesdays. But no one knows why. We just disappear if we break them." Leon's mind raced. His interface was showing him the rule strings, the underlying code of this nightmare. In hell, he'd fought demons with tooth and claw, but here, the battlefield was narrative. These cosmic horrors had turned Earth into a story, and humanity were characters following scripts they couldn't read. He felt a cold anger settle in his chest. 1,000 years of survival, only to come home to this. At 2:58 p.m., Henry began to hyperventilate. "He's coming. You have to go. Please. Stay behind me," Leon said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He positioned himself between Henry and the door, his body falling into a combat stance honed over centuries. His interface hummed, scanning the environment. The rule strings in the apartment glowed faintly, dozens of them, layered like spiderwebs. Most were minor: don't eat the bread after midnight, the mirror reflects only regret. But one was pulsing with increasing intensity, centered on the door. 3 p.m. The clock's ticking seemed to grow louder, though Leon knew it was digital. A chill seeped under the door, frosting the edges. Henry whimpered, covering his eyes. The door didn't open. Instead, a figure phased through it, tall, wearing a nondescript gray suit, with a head that was smooth and featureless where a face should be. No eyes, no mouth, just blank skin. The faceless man. It stood perfectly still, and Leon felt a pressure in the air, like reality itself was holding its breath. His interface flashed. Rule string detected: on Tuesdays, eye contact triggers assimilation. Entity, faceless man. Threat level, medium. The text scrolled in his vision, glitching with corrupted data. Leon focused, activating his string manipulation protocol. The rule string unfolded before him, lines of glowing code that defined this horror. He could see the logic, a simple conditional trigger. If Tuesday equals true and I_contact equals true, then assimilate _target. He couldn't delete it outright, the system strain would be catastrophic, maybe even fry his interface. But he could edit it. Add a clause. A loophole. His mind raced through possibilities. The rule was specific, it needed eye contact. What could break that? Sunglasses? No, too obvious, and the entity might adapt. Something absurd. Something the narrative wouldn't expect. Henry peeked through his fingers. Don't look at him, he hissed. The faceless man took a step forward. Its head tilted, as if studying Leon. A rule string flickered around it, assimilation protocol initiated. Eye contact required. Leon's interface prompted him, enter edit mode. Y/N. He selected yes. The world around him slowed, the colors leaching out until only the rule strings remained, bright against the gray. His fingers moved in the air, manipulating the code. He found the I_contact condition and added a new line, unless the viewer is wearing mismatched socks. The system screamed in his head. Warning, narrative rewrite detected. System cooldown initiated, 24 hours. Pain lanced through his temples, sharp and burning. He gritted his teeth, forcing the edit to save. The rule string glitched violently, the new clause stitching itself into the logic. Time snapped back. The faceless man was inches away, its blank head looming. Leon deliberately looked down at his own feet. He was wearing boots, socks hidden. But the rule didn't require him to show the socks, just to be wearing them. And he was. One black, one navy blue, a habit from hell where matching anything was a luxury. The entity froze. Its form flickered, static crawling over the gray suit. The rule string around it rewrote itself in real time, the new clause integrating. The faceless man's head twitched. It took a step back, then another. A sound emerged from where its mouth should be, a distorted whisper, like radio static. Then, with a final glitch, it vanished. The pressure in the room lifted. Henry uncovered his eyes, staring at the empty space where the entity had been. What did you do? Leon sank into a chair, the pain in his head receding to a throbbing ache. His interface displayed a new message, system cooldown active, 23 hours, 59 minutes remaining. String manipulation protocol unavailable. He'd bought them time, but he was vulnerable now. No more hacks for a day. I gave it a reason not to take us, Leon said, his voice tired. He looked at Henry. You're safe. For now. But his interface wasn't done. As he stood, a new alert flashed, urgent and red. Multiple entities converging on location. Sources, unknown. Threat level, escalating. The words hung in his vision, stark against the dim room. Leon moved to the window, pulling the blanket aside again. The street was still empty, but now the air shimmered with distortions, half-seen shapes moving at the edges of perception. A shadow detached from a building across the way, too many limbs. Something crawled up a lamppost, leaving a trail of glitching light. In the distance, a figure watched from a rooftop, its eyes glowing faintly, the observer-class enforcer from the alley, still tracking him. Henry joined him, trembling. What's happening? They know I'm here, Leon said quietly. The faceless man had been a test, maybe. Or a trap. And his hack had set off alarms. The cosmic horrors were noticing the loophole user, and they were sending more pieces to the board. He could fight, 1,000 years in hell had taught him that much. But without his string manipulation, he'd be relying on brute force in a world where rules were weapons. And the rules were multiplying. His interface scrolled with new detections, entities approaching from all directions, each with their own deadly narratives. Leon turned from the window, his mind already calculating. The apartment wasn't defensible. Too many entry points, too many unknown rules embedded in the walls. He needed to move Henry somewhere safer, at least temporarily. And he needed to understand what was converging on them, before it arrived. "Grab anything you need," he told Henry. "We're leaving." As Henry scrambled to collect a few items, Leon watched the street. The distortions were getting closer, solidifying into forms that defied logic, a thing made of whispering paper, another that was all teeth and fog. His interface logged them one by one, threat levels rising. The observer on the rooftop hadn't moved, but its eyes were fixed on him, unblinking. The pain in his head was a constant reminder, he'd played his best card, and now the game was escalating. And somewhere beyond the glitching reality, the cosmic horrors were watching, turning the page to the next chapter of their narrative. The Tuesday afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement of Leon's neighborhood, but the light felt thin and insubstantial, like a projection over something darker. Leon leaned against the brick wall of his apartment building, the rough surface familiar against his back. His system interface still showed the 24-hour cooldown timer for string manipulation protocol, 18 hours, 37 minutes remaining. The numbers glowed faintly in his peripheral vision, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. He could feel the strain from yesterday's hack lingering in his temples, a dull ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. 1,000 years in hell had taught him to read pain like a language. This was the cost of bending reality, not the physical exhaustion of combat. He flexed his hands, calloused palms rough against his jeans. The combat skills remained, muscle memory honed through millennia of demon battles, but against these rule-bound entities, strength alone was like trying to punch a ghost. From the third-floor window above, he heard Henry Miller's voice, tight with the same terror that had gripped him yesterday. "No, please, I didn't mean to," the words cut off abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than sound. Leon pushed off the wall, his movements fluid despite the system strain. The stairwell door groaned on rusted hinges as he entered, the scent of mildew and old paint filling his nostrils. His boots made no sound on the concrete steps, another skill from hell, moving without echo. As he reached the second-floor landing, the air grew colder. Not the chill of autumn, but the unnatural cold that seeped from between realities. Through the open door of apartment 2B, Leon saw it. The smiling man stood in the center of the living room, its form wavering like heat haze over asphalt. It wore a suit that might have been black or midnight blue, the color seemed to shift at the edges of vision. Its face was a stretched canvas of pale skin, pulled taut over sharp cheekbones, and its smile was a fixed crescent that showed too many teeth, all perfectly white and uniform. In the corner, Mrs. Henderson, Leon recognized her from the building directory, cowered against her floral-patterned sofa, her knitting needles trembling in her hands. She was in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes were wide with the kind of fear that had already accepted its own ending. Leon's system interface flickered to life despite the cooldown, displaying read-only information in shimmering blue text that hovered in his vision. Entity identified, smiling man. Class, Soul Harvester. Active rule strings detected. He focused, and the rule strings appeared as glowing lines of text that wrapped around the entity like ethereal chains. They pulsed with a sickly yellow light, each character sharp and precise. Rule 1, must approach isolated human after sunset. Rule 2, must ask 3 questions. Rule 3, if human answers all 3, claim soul. Rule 4, if human refuses or flees, claim soul immediately. The smiling man's voice was a dry rustle, like pages turning in an empty library. First question, it said, not moving its lips. The smile remained fixed. What do you fear most in the darkness? Mrs. Henderson's breath hitched. I don't. Her knitting needles clattered to the floor. Leon stepped into the apartment. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. His breath fogged in the air. Interesting methodology, he said, his voice calm. But predictable. The smiling man's head rotated toward him, the movement smooth and mechanical. Its eyes were black pools without pupils. Interloper detected. Protocol unchanged. Second question, it continued, turning back to Mrs. Henderson. What memory haunts your dreams? Leon moved between them. The system interface flashed a warning, string manipulation protocol unavailable, cooldown active. But there were other functions. He accessed the diagnostic suite, a subsystem normally used for analyzing demonic energy patterns in hell. Here, it showed the rule string structural integrity. The lines connecting "ask 3 questions" to "claim soul" were thick and stable, but the conditional logic had vulnerabilities. "You're working with binary outcomes," Leon said, circling the entity. His combat instincts assessed distances, angles, potential movements. "Answer or refuse, claim soul. No room for creative interpretation." The smiling man ignored him. "Third question." "Wait," Leon interrupted. He focused his will, not on editing the strings, that was impossible right now, but on overloading the diagnostic suite to force a temporary feedback loop. The system wasn't designed for this, but 1,000 years had taught him how to break tools and rebuild them mid-fight. Mental energy drained from him like blood from a wound. The ache in his temples sharpened to a stabbing pain. Diagnostic override initiated. Warning, mental strain critical. The rule strings flickered. For a fraction of a second, the connection between "claim soul" and the rest of the sequence glitched. "Third question," the smiling man said, its voice gaining a static equality. "What recipe would you use for chocolate cake?" Mrs. Henderson blinked. "What?" "Answer the question," Leon said through gritted teeth. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The mental strain was worse than he'd anticipated, like trying to hold up a collapsing building with bare hands. My grandmother's recipe," Mrs. Henderson stammered. 1 cup sugar, 3/4 cup cocoa powder, 1 3/4 cups flour." The smiling man's form shuddered. Its smile twitched. The rule strings in Leon's vision scrambled, the text fragmenting and reassembling. Rule 3, if human answers all 3, recite baking recipes. The change held for 3 seconds before the original text tried to reassert itself. Leon pushed harder, pouring every ounce of concentration into maintaining the override. His vision blurred at the edges. The room tilted. He could feel the entity fighting back, not with claws or teeth, but with the sheer weight of its programmed existence. This wasn't combat, it was a tug-of-war with reality itself. "Recipe acknowledged," the smiling man said, its voice now flat and robotic. "Initiating recitation protocol." It began speaking in that same dry rustle, but the words were different: classic chocolate cake. Preheat oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Grease and flour 2 9-inch round pans. In a large bowl, combine sugar, flour, cocoa, baking powder, baking soda, and salt. Add eggs, milk, oil, and vanilla. Beat on medium speed for 2 minutes. Mrs. Henderson stared, her fear momentarily overshadowed by confusion. The recitation continued for 2 full minutes. The smiling man listed ingredients, measurements, mixing techniques, baking times. Its form wavered more violently, the edges bleeding into static. Leon kept the override active, his breathing shallow and rapid. The mental drain was immense, he could feel it leaching into his physical body, making his limbs heavy, his thoughts sluggish. When the recipe finished, the smiling man fell silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then its head tilted. The black eyes seemed to focus on Leon with new intensity. Its form, which had been translucent and shifting, began to solidify. The suit became crisper, the edges sharper. The smile remained, but now it looked less like a fixed expression and more like a deliberate choice. "Override detected," it said, and its voice had changed, deeper, more resonant, with an undercurrent of anger that hadn't been there before. "Loophole user identified. Adaptive protocols engaged." It took a step forward. The floorboards didn't creak. System manipulation noted. Countermeasures developing. Leon backed toward the door, pulling Mrs. Henderson with him. His head throbbed with the aftermath of the strain. The world swam in and out of focus. The smiling man didn't pursue immediately, it stood there, solidifying further, its form gaining weight and presence in the room. "Recitation complete," it said. "Primary function temporarily suspended. Secondary function, analyze and adapt." Its black eyes tracked Leon's movement. "You have made a mistake." Outside, the afternoon light had taken on a sickly yellow hue. Leon guided Mrs. Henderson down the stairs, his own steps unsteady. Behind them, from the apartment, came a sound that wasn't quite laughter, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in the bones rather than the air. The smiling man was still visible through the open door, standing perfectly still in the center of the room. But now its hands were clenched at its sides. And its smile had tightened at the corners, pulling into something that looked almost like rage. A sharp, drilling pain blossomed behind Leon's eyes as he stumbled into his apartment, the door clicking shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silence. He leaned against the wall, breathing ragged, each inhale tasting of ozone and static. The world swam before him, not the physical world of peeling wallpaper and dusty floorboards, but the glitching overlay of rule strings that his system interface projected onto reality. They flickered now, unstable, like faulty neon signs in a rainstorm. His interface flashed warnings in the corner of his vision, crimson text scrolling too fast to read fully, cosmic backlash detected, system strain, 78%, frequent rule manipulation has attracted attention. Leon squeezed his eyes shut, but the warnings persisted, burned into his retinas. He could feel it, a pressure building in his skull, as if something vast and indifferent were pressing against the edges of his mind. This wasn't the clean, brutal exhaustion of a 1,000-year war in hell, where fatigue meant muscle ache and demon blood crusted under his nails. This was subtler, more invasive. It felt like reality itself was rejecting his tampering. He made it to the threadbare couch in the living room, collapsing onto it with a groan that was half pain, half frustration. The apartment was a time capsule from before his disappearance, but now it felt alien. A rule string hovered over the window, curtains closed after dusk prevents window gazer assimilation. He'd hacked that one yesterday, changing it to, curtains closed after dusk triggers a polite knock, but now the string glitched erratically, letters scrambling and reforming. His interface pinged, rule integrity compromised. Cosmic feedback loop detected. Leon pressed his palms against his temples, trying to massage away the headache. Memories surfaced unbidden, not of Earth, but of hell. The endless crimson skies, the sulfur stench, the demon hordes that came in waves like a tide of teeth and claws. He'd fought them for a millennium, leveling up through sheer survival, his system interface evolving from a basic combat log to something that could parse the very fabric of that infernal realm. But there, the rules were straightforward: kill or be killed, dodge the acid spit, avoid the soul-rending screams. Here, the rules were insidious. They were narratives, stories with deadly punchlines, and breaking them didn't require strength, it required understanding loopholes he could barely glimpse before hacking them. A soft knock at the door jolted him. His interface flashed, entity detected, minor class, shadow lurker. Rule, knocks 3 times before phasing through solid matter. Leon didn't move. His string manipulation protocol was still recovering from the overload he'd used on the smiling man, and the system strain warnings screamed at him to avoid further hacking. Instead, he reached for the combat instincts honed over millennia. His body moved on autopilot, muscles remembering patterns older than this apartment. He rose silently, picking up a heavy book from the coffee table, a dusty encyclopedia from the 1990s. The knock came again, a second tap that sounded like fingernails on bone. Leon positioned himself beside the door, breathing shallowly. The third knock echoed, and the door's surface shimmered, a dark, oily shadow beginning to seep through the wood. As it solidified into a vaguely humanoid form with too many jointed limbs, Leon swung the book. It wasn't a weapon from hell, no enchanted blade or demon-forged mace, but it was solid, and his strength was max level. The impact made a wet, crunching sound. The entity let out a static-filled shriek before dissolving into motes of darkness that evaporated like smoke. His interface logged, minor entity neutralized via physical force. No rule hacking detected. System strain decreasing slowly. He waited, listening. The hallway outside was silent, but his interface showed other rule strings flickering in the building. Stairwell whispers after midnight lead to disappearance, mirrors reflect alternate realities during power outages. They were like tripwires, and he was a bomb walking among them. He returned to the couch, forcing himself to sit still. Rest. That was the resolution he'd settled on, a day of recovery, avoiding any rule hacking, letting his system interface recalibrate. It felt unnatural. In hell, rest was a luxury paid for in blood. Here, it was a necessity to prevent his mind from fracturing under cosmic backlash. Hours passed. Leon dozed fitfully, the headache receding to a dull throb. He ate sparingly from canned goods in the pantry, his body still adjusting to Earth's food after millennia of demon flesh and hell-foraged roots. He cleaned his apartment methodically, the mundane tasks a grounding ritual. Each movement was precise, a warrior's economy of motion applied to sweeping dust. He checked on Henry Miller through the peephole. The neighbor was huddled in his own apartment, curtains drawn, likely terrified after the faceless man incident. Leon considered knocking, offering reassurance, but he knew his presence might attract more entities. Better to let the man hide. As dusk fell, the rule strings outside grew more active, glowing brighter in his vision. He watched from the window, curtain cracked open just enough to see the street below. A woman hurried past, her steps too quick, and a rule string flared around her, walking alone after sunset triggers footstep echo entity. She made it to her door just as the string glitched. Leon hadn't hacked this one, but his earlier manipulation seemed to have caused localized instability. The entity manifested as a pair of floating shoes that tapped behind her, then vanished when she stepped inside. She never noticed. Leon's interface noted, cosmic rules showing adaptive fluctuations. Observer class enforcer protocol still active. He thought of the shadowy figure with too many eyes from the rooftop, the observer class enforcer. It was watching, he was sure. Not attacking, just observing. Like a game master noting a player's unusual strategy. The idea chilled him more than any demon's roar. In hell, enemies were straightforward, they wanted to kill you, eat you, corrupt you. Here, the threats were narrative. They wanted to tell a story, and if you broke the plot, they rewrote it around you. Night deepened. Leon lay on the couch, too weary to move to the bed. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by memories of hellfire and the glitching rule strings that now wove through his dreams. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were just background noise, a susurrus-like static between radio stations. But they coalesced, forming words in a language that wasn't language. It was data streams given voice, glitching syntax that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his mind. His system interface flared to life in the dream state, projecting text in his vision, cosmic transmission detected. Source, unknown. Translation attempted. The whispers resolved into phrases, each word flickering like broken code. The game master notices. The voice was neither male nor female, but vast, echoing from somewhere beyond the stars. Loophole user, anomaly in the narrative. Leon tried to move in the dream, to shout, but he was paralyzed, a spectator in his own mind. Prepare for a personalized narrative. The words hung in the air, and with them came images, not of monsters, but of scenarios. A street that folded in on itself, a house with rooms that shifted like a kaleidoscope, a neighbor's face melting into a rule string that read, assimilation, inescapable. They were possibilities, storylines being drafted for him. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of glitching tones that felt like needles in his brain. His system interface flashed warnings, cosmic intrusion detected. Mental integrity at risk. Recommend immediate disconnection. But there was no disconnecting. This was part of the world now, the narrative reaching out to shape him. Just as the dream threatened to shatter his sanity, he felt a jolt, and his eyes snapped open. He was back on the couch, drenched in cold sweat, the apartment dark except for the moonlight filtering through the curtains. His headache was gone, replaced by a profound, unsettling clarity. His system interface showed a new log, cosmic transmission intercepted and archived. Source traced to higher cosmic horror entity, Game Master class. Personalized narrative threat confirmed. Observer class enforcer protocol intensifying. Leon sat up, his hands steady now. The rest had done its job, his system strain had dropped to 45%, and the backlash warnings had faded. But the cost was this knowledge. They knew about him. Not just the observer, but the things behind the observer, the ancient horrors weaving these rules. And they weren't going to let him hack their story unchecked. They were preparing something for him, a narrative tailored to exploit his weaknesses, to turn his loopholes into traps. He stood, walking to the window. The street outside was quiet, rule strings glowing softly like malevolent fireflies. In the distance, on a rooftop, he could just make out a silhouette, too many eyes reflecting the moonlight. Watching. Always watching. Leon didn't hack any rules. He just watched back, his mind already working, not on how to break a rule, but on how to survive a story written specifically to end him. The whispers echoed in his memory, a promise and a threat, prepare for a personalized narrative. And he knew, with the certainty of a warrior who'd faced down hell itself, that the real battle was just beginning. The headache had receded to a dull throb behind Leon's temples, a persistent reminder of the system strain that still hovered at 45%. Morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the apartment building stairwell, casting long shadows across peeling paint and cracked linoleum. Leon stood at the base of the stairs, his eyes tracing the familiar path he'd climbed countless times in a different life, a life before hell, before cosmic rules, before strings of glitching text defined reality. He'd spent the morning listening. Not with his ears alone, but with the heightened awareness carved into him over 1,000 years of demon battles. The building had a rhythm now, a fearful cadence. Footsteps would climb the first 2 steps with normal weight, then hesitate. A breath held. A careful, almost weightless step over the 3rd stair. Then the release of tension as feet landed on the 4th. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned it yesterday when he checked on her after the Smiling Man incident. Her hands had trembled around her teacup. It's the 3rd stair, Leon. Always creaks. Except when it doesn't. And when it doesn't. She trailed off, eyes darting toward her door. Something's listening. Leon climbed now, his combat-honed movements silent despite his size. 1st step, normal creak of old wood. 2nd step, another groan. He paused on the landing before the 3rd. The stair looked identical to the others, worn oak, slightly darker from decades of foot traffic. But as he focused, his system interface flickered to life without activation, a subconscious response to concentrated threat assessment. He didn't trigger the full view yet. Instead, he knelt, running a hand along the wood's grain. His fingers remembered this texture. This building had been his home once, before the millennium in hell. Before he'd returned to find reality rewritten by unseen hands. The familiarity was a ghost, a memory of normalcy that made the current horror more grotesque. Voices drifted from above. Leon recognized Henry Miller's nervous tenor. I told you, Sarah, you can't just skip it. You have to step lightly. If it doesn't creak. Then what? A woman's voice, younger, edged with frustration. We live like this forever. Tiptoeing around stairs. My son hasn't laughed in weeks because he's afraid of making noise. Leon rose. The conversation confirmed what he'd suspected, the rule wasn't just a localized anomaly. It had woven itself into the building's social fabric, dictating behavior through unspoken terror. He took a deliberate step onto the 3rd stair. Silence. The wood didn't creak. It didn't groan. It made no sound at all, as if absorbing the pressure of his foot into some void. Immediately, the air changed. Not a temperature drop, that would have been too obvious for cosmic rules. Instead, the quality of silence deepened, becoming thick and attentive. Leon felt watched, though no observer appeared. The hairs on his arms stood up, a primal response to violation of natural law. System interface, view local rule strings. The command was mental, barely a whisper in his consciousness. The world fractured into overlapping layers. Reality remained, the stairwell, the dust motes dancing in sunlight, but superimposed over it were lines of glitching text, shimmering like heat haze. Most were background rules. Gravity operates at 9.8 meters per square second, time flows forward, mundane foundations of physics. But one string pulsed with malevolent energy, wrapped around the 3rd stair like a serpent. Leon focused. The text resolved. Rule_string, apartment_building_7/stair_3. Condition, silence_on_contact. Trigger, summon_entity_listener. Entity_class, auditory_predator. Behavior, assimilate_sound_sources. Note, creak_normal equals safe, creak_absent equals hunt. The string glitched as he read it, letters stuttering between existence and void. This was more sophisticated than the Faceless Man's Tuesday rule or the Smiling Man's question protocol. This rule had nested conditions, a binary logic gate built into reality itself. Either the stair creaked, safe, or it didn't, hunt. No middle ground. No exceptions unless hacked. Leon's mind worked through the implications. The rule didn't specify what constituted silence, only the absence of the expected creak. That was a vulnerability. All rules had vulnerabilities, he'd learned that in hell, where demonic pacts always had loopholes for those patient enough to find them. But hacking this would require precision. His string manipulation protocol was still recovering from the overload he'd inflicted during the Smiling Man incident. The diagnostic suite trick had bought him time but left his system fragile, like bone healing from a fracture. He stepped off the stair. The attentive silence vanished, replaced by normal building sounds, a distant radio, pipes knocking, Henry Miller still arguing upstairs. Leon exhaled slowly, calculating strain costs. Minor edits were possible even with his protocol recovering. He couldn't rewrite the rule entirely, that would spike his system strain back into dangerous territory, but he could add a clause. A harmless redirect. System interface, edit rule string apartment _building _7/stair_3. A warning flickered at the edge of his vision, system _strain, 45% projected 52% with edit. Acceptable. The interface presented the string as editable text, cursors blinking at the trigger line. Leon focused, his mind forming the addition. Not deletion, that would alert the cosmic rulemakers too directly. Not replacement, too much energy. An addition, nestled into existing logic. His mental command inserted the text. Alternate _trigger, if silence _on _contact, activate confetti _explosion. Confetti _spec, non _toxic, biodegradable, rainbow _spectrum. Entity _suppression, listener _entity _redirected _t _observe confetti. The string glitched violently, letters scrambling as reality resisted the change. Leon felt the strain immediately, a sharp pain behind his eyes, like ice picks driven into his temples. His vision blurred at the edges. But he held focus, forcing the edit through. The rule restabilized, the new lines weaving into the existing text. The glitching settled into a new pattern, less malevolent, almost confused. He stepped onto the third stair again. Silence. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the air filled with a soft popping sound, like 100 tiny balloons bursting at once. Confetti erupted from the stair itself, not from above or below, but from the wood grain, as if reality had decided the stair was now a celebration device. Rainbow-colored paper strips showered the stairwell, drifting lazily in the sunlight. They smelled faintly of vanilla and ozone. From upstairs, a child's laugh echoed. Then Henry Miller's bewildered voice, "What in God's name?" Leon allowed himself a small smile. The strain had climbed to 53%, higher than projected, but the result was worth it. The listener entity hadn't appeared. The rule had been satisfied by the confetti trigger, the auditory predator presumably redirected to observe harmless paper instead of hunting sound sources. He climbed to the next landing, confetti sticking to his boots. Henry appeared at his door, eyes wide. "Leon. Did you?" "The stair should be safe now," Leon said, keeping his voice low. "It'll creak normally, or if it doesn't, you get a show." Sarah emerged from another apartment, a boy of about 6 clinging to her leg. The child stared at the confetti with wonder, then cautiously approached the third stair. He stepped on it lightly. A normal creak sounded. He jumped on it. Another creak. He looked back at his mother, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time in weeks. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, tears in her eyes. "I don't know how you did it, but thank you." Leon nodded, but his attention was already elsewhere. His system interface was flashing a subtle alert, adaptive _fluctuations _detected _local _rule strings. The hack had worked, but it had also sent ripples through the local reality fabric. Rules weren't isolated, they interconnected, forming a web. Tug one thread, and others vibrated. He spent the next hour walking the building, checking on other residents. The confetti had become a topic of bewildered joy. Old Mr. Garrett, who hadn't left his apartment in months, stood in his doorway chuckling as he picked a blue paper strip from his beard. The fear was lifting, replaced by cautious relief. But Leon felt no relief himself. Every hack made him more visible. The observer class enforcer was still watching, he could feel its too many eyes somewhere above, though the rooftop was empty when he glanced up through a window. As afternoon faded into evening, Leon returned to his temporary room. Mrs. Henderson had insisted he use her spare bedroom after saving her. He sat on the edge of the bed, massaging his temples. The strain had receded to 50%, a slow recovery. He needed to be careful. Too many hacks too quickly would burn out his system entirely, leaving him blind to the rule strings. And blind in this world was death. He was about to lie down when the air in the room thickened. Not with silence this time, but with a low hum, like distant machinery powering up. His system interface activated without command, flooding his vision with warning glyphs. Entity _detected, class _rule weaver. Threat _level, escalated. Behavior, personalized _horror generation. Note, targeting _loophole user. Leon stood, his combat instincts overriding fatigue. The room's walls seemed to breathe, patterns in the wallpaper shifting. Not just shifting, unraveling. Threads of light peeled from the surfaces, glowing with the same sickly energy as rule strings. They wove through the air, stitching together forms that flickered in and out of existence, a childhood nightmare of drowning, a memory of a demon's claws scraping his armor in hell, the face of someone he'd failed to save centuries ago. The threads coalesced into a central mass at the room's center. It had no fixed shape, it was a tapestry of horrors, constantly reweaving itself. Glowing strings formed limbs that were half human, half abstract geometry. Eyes blinked open along its surface, each showing a different fragment of Leon's past. A mouth formed from knotted threads, speaking in a chorus of whispers that echoed his own thoughts back at him. You edit rules, the voices whispered, layered and wrong. You break narratives. We weave new ones. Personalized. Just for you. Leon's hand went to where a weapon would have been in hell, but he carried none here. His true weapon was his system, and it was strained, tired. The rule weaver advanced, threads stretching toward him like probing fingers. Each thread glowed with text, not full rules, but fragments, clauses, conditions waiting to be assembled into a horror designed specifically to bypass his defenses. The entity's form solidified further, becoming a grotesque loom of light and memory, aimed directly at him. The last of the daylight vanished from the window, as if the room had been severed from the outside world. All that remained was the weaver, the glowing threads, and Leon standing between them and everything he was trying to protect. The rule weaver solidified in Leon's bedroom, its form a tapestry of glowing strings that pulsed with sickly green light. Each thread shimmered with text-like glyphs, rule strings that Leon's system interface automatically parsed as they manifested. The entity stood 7 feet tall, its body a constantly shifting latticework of cosmic code that hummed with malicious intent. Leon's combat instincts, honed over a millennium in hell, screamed at him to move, but the room had already been severed from the outside world. The walls shimmered with containment fields, rule strings woven so densely they formed an impenetrable barrier. Loophole user detected, the weaver's voice echoed, not through air but directly into Leon's mind. It sounded like tearing parchment and breaking glass. Narrative corruption identified. Initiating personalized countermeasure protocol. Leon's system interface flashed warnings across his vision. System strain, 53%. Rule weaver entity detected. Containment field active, escape probability 0.02%. He took a steadying breath, forcing down the panic that threatened to surface. Demons he could fight. Cosmic bureaucracy required different tactics. The weaver's threads began to glow brighter, and the room dissolved around him. One moment he stood on his worn carpet, the next he was back in the sulphurous plains of hell. The transition wasn't gradual, it was instantaneous and complete. The stench of burning flesh filled his nostrils, so real he gagged. Heat washed over him, the dry, oppressive heat of eternal damnation that he'd spent centuries enduring. Memory extraction complete, the weaver's voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. Generating personalized horror scenario. Leon looked down at his hands. They were covered in demon blood, just as they had been during the siege of the Screaming Citadel. The memory was perfect, every detail reconstructed from his psyche. He could feel the weight of his hell-forged armor, hear the distant screams of lesser demons being torn apart by greater ones. But this wasn't memory playback. The system interface showed him the truth, illusory reality detected. Rule string analysis, generates fears from target psyche. Psychological integrity, 94% and declining. The ground split open before him, and a figure emerged, not a demon, but something worse. It wore his own face, twisted with the madness that had nearly consumed him during his 3rd century in hell. The doppelganger smiled with Leon's mouth but with eyes that held only void. You thought you escaped, it said in Leon's own voice. But hell follows. Always. Leon's heart hammered against his ribs. The psychological attack was clever, using his own trauma against him. His system interface tracked his vital signs, adrenaline spike detected. Cortisol levels critical. Psychological integrity, 87%. If it dropped below 80%, the illusions would become indistinguishable from reality, and his mind would break. He focused on the rule strings. They floated through the hellscape like glowing ribbons, connecting the Weaver to the nightmare. The primary string read, Rule Weaver Core Protocol, generates personalized horrors from target's psychological profile. Integrity, 98%. Secondary strings branched off, each governing aspects of the illusion, sensory feedback, 100%, emotional amplification, 95%, memory reconstruction accuracy, 99%. The doppelganger advanced, drawing a sword that matched Leon's own hell-forged blade. Every demon you killed, it whispered, every soul you watched burn, they're all here. Waiting for you. Behind the doppelganger, figures emerged from the sulfur mist. Faces Leon remembered, comrades who had fallen during the 1,000-Year War, demons he'd shown mercy to who later betrayed him, even the first human soul he'd failed to save when he was still new to hell. The Weaver wasn't just replaying memories, it was constructing new horrors from the raw material of his guilt. Leon's hands trembled. Not from fear of combat, he'd faced worse, but from the psychological precision of the attack. The system interface flashed, psychological integrity, 82%. He was slipping. He forced his mind to focus. The rule strings. He needed to hack them. But his string manipulation protocol was still recovering from the stair hack. Protocol cooldown, 47% complete. He couldn't wait. Every second in this nightmare eroded his sanity further. The doppelganger lunged. Leon parried on instinct, the clash of blades ringing through the hellscape. The impact felt real, the vibration traveled up his arm exactly as it should. The Weaver had perfected sensory feedback. Psychological integrity, 80%. The warning flashed red in his vision. Think. He couldn't edit the primary rule string directly, the Weaver's defenses were too strong. But maybe he didn't need to. The system interface showed him the string structure, it generated fears based on psychological profile, then amplified them through sensory and emotional feedback loops. What if he broke the loop? Leon dodged another strike, rolling across ground that felt like broken bone fragments. He accessed his system interface's emergency functions. Diagnostic suite available. Warning, overload risk extreme. He'd used this before on the smiling man, and it had nearly broken him. But he had no choice. As the doppelganger prepared another attack, Leon focused on a specific subsection of the rule string, emotional amplification protocol. Instead of trying to disable it, he injected new code. His fingers moved through the air, manipulating invisible interfaces only he could see. Each command burned through his mental reserves. System strain, 61%. Mental integrity, 78%. He didn't try to stop the fear generation. Instead, he targeted the amplification loop. The string read, if fear detected, amplify by factor X. Leon edited it to, if fear detected, generate joy instead. The change wasn't clean. He couldn't rewrite the entire protocol, the Weaver's defenses resisted every character. So he made it recursive. If fear detected, generate joy. If joy detected, check for fear. If fear detected, generate JOY, an infinite loop that would consume the Weaver's processing power. Pain exploded behind Leon's eyes. Blood trickled from his nose, warm and metallic on his lips. System strain, 89%. Mental integrity, 65%. The diagnostic suite screamed warnings about neural overload, but he pushed through. The doppelganger froze mid-swing. Its face, his face, twisted in confusion. The hellscape around them flickered. For a moment, Leon saw his bedroom walls through the illusion, then they vanished again as the Weaver fought the hack. Error, the Weaver's voice stuttered. Emotional protocol corruption detected. The doppelganger's expression changed. The madness in its eyes softened. It lowered its sword. It began, then smiled. Not a twisted smile, but a genuine one. I feel happy. Behind it, the figures from Leon's memories stopped their advance. One of them, a demon he'd killed in the Battle of Blood Rivers, started laughing. Not a malicious laugh, but the joyful laughter of someone hearing a good joke. The sound was so incongruous in hell that it broke the nightmare's cohesion. The weaver itself began to glitch. Its tapestry of strings flickered between green and pink. The containment field around the room shimmered, growing unstable. Rule Weaver status, feedback loop detected. Entity processing power, 42% and declining. Joy detected, the Weaver announced, its voice losing coherence. Checking for fear. Fear detected. Generating joy. Joy detected. Checking for fear. The recursive loop had taken hold. The Weaver was trapped in its own protocol, endlessly checking for emotions and generating their opposites. The hellscape dissolved completely, revealing Leon's bedroom once more. The Weaver stood in the center of the room, its strings pulsing erratically as it repeated the same diagnostic cycle. Leon collapsed to his knees. The mental strain hit him like a physical blow. More blood flowed from his nose, dripping onto the carpet. His head throbbed with a pain deeper than any demon's claw had ever inflicted. System strain, 97%. Critical overload imminent. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. The room spun around him. Through blurry vision, he watched the Weaver glitch. Its form flickered between solid and transparent. Strings snapped and rewove themselves, only to snap again. The entity was disabled, temporarily. But Leon knew it wouldn't last. The hack was a stopgap, not a solution. His system interface flashed a final, urgent warning. Text scrolled across his vision in bright red letters, cosmic attention peaked. Rule manipulation signature detected by multiple entities. Entity reinforcements inbound. Estimated arrival, 6 to 12 hours. Leon tried to crawl toward the door, but darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was the Weaver, still stuck in its feedback loop, glowing strings flickering like a broken neon sign. Then everything went black. Leon woke to the taste of copper in his mouth and a pounding headache that felt like his skull was being slowly crushed between tectonic plates. 2 days had passed since his collapse. He knew this from the pale light filtering through his bedroom window, shifting from dawn to dusk and back again in a cycle he could track through the haze of pain. His body lay where he'd fallen, muscles screaming with the memory of strain, but the Weaver's domain was gone. The room was just a room again, his modest apartment with its worn furniture and the lingering scent of ozone. He pushed himself up slowly, every movement deliberate. Blood had dried in a crusted trail from his nose to his chin. His system interface flickered in his vision, displaying warnings in muted amber text, system strain, 68%, recovery in progress. The number was lower than the catastrophic overload he'd experienced, but still dangerously high. He could feel the cosmic backlash like a low hum in his bones, reminder that hacking reality came with a price. The Weaver's defeat had left something behind. Not a corpse, entities like that didn't leave physical remains, but a pocket reality that hadn't fully dissipated. In the corner of his room, the air shimmered with a faint, iridescent glow, like heat haze over asphalt on a summer day. Through it, Leon could see glimpses of something else, a space that wasn't his apartment, filled with shifting geometries and floating objects that defied normal physics. The Weaver's domain, now accessible in its disabled state. Leon approached cautiously, his combat instincts from 1,000 years in hell screaming at him to treat this as hostile territory. But his system interface showed no active threats, just the residual energy of the defeated entity. He reached out, his fingers passing through the shimmering boundary. The sensation was like dipping his hand into cold, viscous liquid. With a deep breath, he stepped through. The pocket reality was smaller than he expected, perhaps the size of a large closet, but it felt infinitely more vast. The walls weren't walls at all, they were shifting tapestries of rule strings, glowing lines of text that writhed and rearranged themselves in patterns too complex for normal human perception. Leon's system interface automatically began parsing them, displaying translations in his peripheral vision, narrative coherence, 87%, entity power draw, primary, rule maintenance protocol, active. Scattered throughout the space were artifacts. Not physical objects in the traditional sense, but crystallized fragments of narrative energy. One looked like a frozen tier of obsidian, hovering at chest height. Another resembled a book with pages that turned themselves, the text written in the same glitching language he'd heard in his dream. A third was a sphere of shifting colors that pulsed in time with some distant heartbeat. Leon moved to the obsidian tear first. As his fingers brushed its surface, his system interface flared to life. Artifact analysis, Weaver's memory crystal, contains data on rule mechanics. He focused, and information flooded his mind, not as words, but as understanding. He saw how entities like the Weaver drew power from narrative coherence, the consistency and believability of the horror stories they enforced. Every rule, every taboo, every deadly encounter strengthened their hold on reality by making the cosmic horror narrative more real to the human consciousness trapped within it. His hacks, he realized, created plot holes, inconsistencies in the narrative that entities had to expend energy to fix. That was why they noticed him. That was why the observer was watching. He wasn't just breaking rules, he was unraveling the very fabric of their story. The book was next. Its pages turned to a section titled Loophole User Protocols in the Glitching Language. Leon's system interface struggled with the translation, but he caught fragments, adaptive countermeasures, personalized narrative threats, escalation protocols activated upon detection. The Weaver had been following these protocols when it attacked him. The book confirmed what he'd suspected, he was now a priority target for every entity in the city. But there was useful data too. Detailed schematics of how rule strings interconnected, how power flowed between them, how minor edits could have cascading effects. Leon spent hours studying, cross-referencing with his own experiences. His system strain ticked down slowly as he worked, dropping from 68% to 62% as his interface adapted to the new information. He found optimization protocols buried in the Weaver's data, ways to streamline his hacks, reduce the cosmic backlash. He implemented them carefully, feeling his system interface reconfigure itself. System upgrade complete, strain cost reduced by 15% from minor edits. It wasn't much, but it was something. The sphere of shifting colors was the last artifact. When he touched it, it unfolded into a three-dimensional map of the city, rendered in glowing lines of light. Most of it was familiar, the grid of streets, the clusters of buildings, but at the center, something pulsed with malevolent energy. A nexus point where rule strings converged so densely they formed a solid knot of narrative power. His system interface labeled it, Narrative Nexus, Primary Enforcement Zone. And there, hovering above the nexus on the map, was an icon he recognized from his earlier encounters, a stylized eye surrounded by weaving threads. The same symbol that had marked the narrative enforcer in his earlier investigations. The entity that maintained rules for the entire city was based there. Of course it would be. The heart of the horror, the control center for this twisted game. Leon stared at the map for a long time, memorizing the route from his neighborhood to the city center. The distance wasn't great, maybe an hour's walk under normal circumstances. But nothing about this world was normal anymore. Every block would be filled with entities, taboos, deadly rules. And at the end of that path waited something powerful enough to enforce reality across an entire metropolitan area. He took one last look around the pocket reality. The rule strings on the walls were fading now, the artifacts beginning to dissolve back into raw narrative energy. The Weaver's domain wouldn't last much longer. Leon gathered what useful data he could, schematic fragments, power flow diagrams, anything that might help him understand the system he was fighting, and stored them in his system interface's memory banks. Then he stepped back through the shimmering boundary into his apartment. The pocket reality collapsed behind him with a sound like tearing silk, leaving only a faint scent of ozone and the memory of glowing strings. His room felt smaller, darker, more real in comparison. His system interface updated, loot analysis complete. Narrative nexus located. Threat assessment, extreme. Leon walked to his window, looking out over the neighborhood he'd been protecting. The streets were quiet in the late afternoon light, but he could see rule strings everywhere now, thin, glowing lines crisscrossing the air, defining the boundaries of taboos and entity territories. Some were stable, pulsing with steady energy. Others flickered and glitched, showing the aftereffects of his hacks. The third stair rule he'd edited to trigger confetti was still active, its strings showing minor adaptive fluctuations as the system tried to repair the plot hole he'd created. In the distance, on a rooftop several blocks away, he could just make out a shadowy figure with too many eyes. The observer class enforcer was still watching. Its observation protocol had intensified, he could feel the weight of its gaze like physical pressure against his skin. But it hadn't moved to attack. Not yet. It was gathering data, studying his methods, waiting for something. Or waiting for him to make a move toward the nexus. Leon's fingers tightened on the windowsill. The map was burned into his memory now, the path to the city center clear in his mind. He could almost see the narrative nexus pulsing there, a cancerous growth at the heart of this twisted reality. Freeing his neighborhood had been the first step. But to truly protect anyone, he'd need to go to the source. And he would. Soon. But first, he needed to recover fully. His system strain was still at 62%, too high for another major confrontation. He turned away from the window, the image of the map's glowing lines lingering in his vision like an afterimage. The artifacts were gone, but the knowledge remained. The understanding of how this horror worked. The location of its heart. He had looted the aftermath. Now he had to decide what to do with what he'd found. The morning light that filtered through Leon's apartment window held a sickly, jaundiced quality, as if the sun itself had been infected by the cosmic rules strangling the city. He stood by the window, watching the street below where people moved with the jerky, fearful motions of prey animals. His system interface hummed quietly in his peripheral vision, displaying his current strain at 62%, a manageable level after the recent upgrade, but he knew that number could spike dangerously with even moderate edits. Leon's fingers traced the edge of the three-dimensional map artifact he'd recovered from the Weaver's domain. The folded paper-like material felt both impossibly ancient and disturbingly alive, its surface shifting with faint luminescent patterns that only his enhanced perception could fully appreciate. When unfolded, it revealed the city's layout not as streets and buildings, but as a tangled web of rule strings converging toward the center, the narrative nexus. The route burned in his memory: follow the thickening strings, avoid the patrol zones marked with shifting red sigils, reach the heart where the narrative enforcer wove reality itself. He packed light, just the essentials. The diagnostic suite module of his system interface glowed with readiness, its analysis functions primed to dissect any rule string he encountered. His millennia of combat experience from hell had taught him that true strength lay not in carrying everything you owned, but in knowing exactly what you needed for the mission ahead. Today's mission required subtlety, not slaughter. The apartment building's hallway felt different now. The third stair, which once triggered a listener entity, now produced a faint popping sound and a shower of harmless confetti when stepped upon silently. Leon watched as Mr. Garrett descended the stairs, his elderly frame pausing at the third step. When the confetti erupted in a burst of rainbow colors, the old man didn't jump, he chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that held genuine amusement. Better than the alternative, he muttered to Leon as they passed. Outside, the city breathed with a different rhythm than Leon remembered from before his 1,000 years in hell. The air tasted of ozone and something else, a metallic tang that reminded him of blood, though no blood was visible. People walked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, their movements calculated to minimize attention. Rule strings floated everywhere, visible only to Leon's enhanced perception, shimmering lines of text that glitched and flickered like bad code, defining the new reality. A woman across the street paused mid-step, her body freezing as a rule string wrapped around her. If speaks between 12:01 a.m. and 5:59 a.m., voice box replaced with silent scream module. The text glowed with malevolent intent. Leon's system interface automatically parsed the string, calculating edit costs. Minor adjustment, 8% strain increase. Changing the punishment entirely, potentially 25% or more. He filed the information away, continuing his journey. The city center lay 3 miles from his neighborhood, but in this new reality, distance measured itself in threats avoided rather than blocks traveled. Leon moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent centuries navigating demon-infested battlefields, his steps silent, his awareness extending in a 360-degree sphere. He didn't run, running attracted attention. Instead, he walked with purposeful calm, his eyes constantly scanning both the physical world and the overlay of rule strings that defined it. Halfway to the center, he encountered his first act of enforcement. A patrol of entities moved down Main Street, 3 figures that looked human until you noticed how their limbs bent at wrong angles, how their shadows moved independently of their bodies. Their rule strings identified them as street wardens, enforce curfew violations with assimilation protocol. People scattered before them like leaves before a storm. Leon ducked into an alley, watching from the shadows. His system interface analyzed the warden's strings. Each had a core rule: must patrol assigned route between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Secondary rules defined their enforcement protocols. Leon considered hacking them, changing their patrol route to send them in circles, or altering their enforcement from assimilation to something harmless. But the strain costs flashed warnings, 15 to 20% per entity for anything beyond cosmetic edits. With the narrative enforcer ahead, he couldn't afford the expenditure. Instead, he waited. The wardens passed, their too many jointed legs clicking against pavement. One paused, its head rotating 180 degrees to scan the alley. Leon held perfectly still, his breathing slowed to near non-existence. After 30 heartbeats, the entity moved on. Leon emerged from the alley and continued. The rule strings grew denser as he approached the city center, overlapping and intertwining until they formed a latticework of restrictions. No whistling on Thursdays. Avoid reflective surfaces during solar noon. Do not count to 13 allowed. Each string pulsed with cosmic energy, their glitches creating localized reality distortions, a patch of sidewalk that seemed to breathe, a streetlight that cast shadows in the wrong direction. He reached what had once been Central Plaza by midday. The transformation was profound. Where fountains and benches once stood, now rose structures of impossible geometry, angles that hurt to look at, surfaces that seemed both solid and liquid simultaneously. The air hummed with power, thick enough to taste. People moved through the plaza in terrified silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the knowledge that any misstep could mean disappearance or worse. Leon positioned himself at the edge of the plaza, near what had been a coffee shop but now resembled a structure grown from fossilized sound waves. His system interface pinged with alerts, multiple high-priority rule strings detected. One in particular caught his attention. It floated above the plaza's center, visible even to normal humans as a shimmering distortion: absolute silence enforced from midnight to 6 a.m. Violation: vocal cords repurposed as decorative elements. The string had a secondary clause: exception, emergency broadcast system alerts. Leon's mind worked through the logic. The exception created a vulnerability, a backdoor in the rules programming. His system interface calculated the edit cost: only 5% strain increase to modify the exception clause. A minor edit, well within his upgraded capabilities. He waited until the plaza's activity reached a lull. The wardens had moved to the northern quadrant, their attention focused on a group of teenagers who'd gathered too close together. Leon activated his string manipulation protocol. The world around him seemed to slow as his perception shifted fully to the rule string overlay. The absolute silence string glowed with malevolent blue light, its text scrolling in an endless loop. With mental commands, Leon isolated the exception clause. The text read: exception, emergency broadcast system alerts may broadcast audio without penalty. He edited it carefully, changing just a few key words: exception, any individual may sing show tunes without penalty. The strain hit him, a sharp pressure behind his eyes, familiar but no less unpleasant. His system strain ticked up from 62% to 67%. The rule string glitched violently, its text scrambling before reforming with the new exception. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a man near the plaza's center, who'd been standing frozen with fear, suddenly burst into song. Oklahoma, he belted out, his voice cracking with terror at first, then gaining strength as he realized no punishment came. Others joined hesitantly, a woman singing Memory from Cats, a teenager attempting Defying Gravity with more enthusiasm than skill. The wardens turned toward the sound, their movements jerky and confused. Their rule strings conflicted, the silence rule had been violated, but the exception now permitted it. They stood frozen, processing the contradiction. Leon watched as their systems overloaded, one by one shutting down into standby mode until the conflict could be resolved by higher authorities. The plaza transformed. Where terrified silence had reigned moments before, now rang with off-key show tunes. People wept as they sang, not from fear but from relief, the first crack in the oppressive rules they'd endured for months. Leon didn't stay to watch. His work here was subtle sabotage, not liberation. The edit would likely be detected and corrected within hours, but for now, it created confusion and conserved his energy for the true target. He moved deeper into the city center, following the thickening web of rule strings. The architecture grew more distorted, buildings leaning at impossible angles, streets folding back on themselves in non-Euclidean patterns. His system interface mapped the distortions, calculating safe paths through reality's warping. Twice more he performed minor edits, each time conserving energy. He changed no eye contact with strangers, rule to, must wink at strangers, causing a patrol of faceless man variants to enter confusion loops as people winked at their featureless faces. Strain, 4% increase. He modified do not touch public art, restriction to, must pat public art affectionately, watching as people tentatively patted a statue that had previously consumed those who touched it. Strain, 6% increase. By late afternoon, his system strain stood at 77%, manageable, but nearing dangerous levels. The upgrades from the Weaver's domain helped, reducing what would have been 10 to 12% increases down to 4 to 6%, but cumulative strain still mounted. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows that moved independently of their sources. Leon reached the final approach to the narrative nexus, a broad avenue that had once been lined with shops but now stood empty except for drifting cosmic dust and the occasional entity patrol. His system interface warned of dense rule string concentrations ahead, 98% overlap, reality stability at 42% and dropping. He moved cautiously, using cover where it existed, a doorway that hadn't fully transformed, the shadow of a building that still cast shadows in the proper direction. The observer-class enforcer was there, watching from a rooftop 2 blocks away. Leon could feel its too many eyes on him, but it didn't interfere. Observation protocol, he remembered. It was gathering data, not engaging. Finally, he reached the edge of the nexus. The city center opened into a vast circular space where all rule strings converged. In the plaza's center, where a clock tower had once stood, now loomed the narrative enforcer. The entity defied simple description. It stood 3 stories tall, a massive construct of shifting limbs and appendages that seemed to be both solid and ethereal simultaneously. Dozens of arms, some humanoid, others insectal or tentacled, moved in constant motion, weaving glowing rule strings into the fabric of reality itself. Each string it handled pulsed with cosmic energy, and as it wove them into the city's metaphysical structure, the air crackled with power. The enforcer's form shifted constantly, never settling into a single shape. One moment it resembled a many-armed deity from some forgotten pantheon, the next a biomechanical horror of gears and flesh, then a tapestry of living light. Its presence radiated oppressive cosmic energy that pressed down on Leon physically, making each breath an effort, each movement requiring conscious will. Around the entity, reality warped visibly. Space folded in on itself, creating pockets where time flowed differently. Colors bled from objects, leaving them monochrome before flooding back in wrong hues. Sounds distorted, the distant traffic became mournful whale song, the wind whispered secrets in dead languages. Leon crouched behind the remnants of a newspaper kiosk, his system interface overloading with data. Analysis scrolled too fast to read fully, entity class, narrative enforcer, power level, exceeds calibration parameters, rule string generation, 147 active threads, reality weaving capacity, city scale. The enforcer worked methodically, repairing the minor disruptions Leon had created throughout the day. It located the sing show tunes exception, examined it with what might have been curiosity, then severed the edited portion and rewove the original silence rule. The singing in the distant plaza cut off abruptly, replaced by renewed terrified silence. It fixed the winking rule, the patting rule, each of Leon's subtle sabotages undone with effortless precision. As it worked, Leon could see the rule strings it handled weren't just restrictions. They were narratives, storylines enforced upon reality, each containing not just rules but consequences, characters, plot points. The city wasn't just under rules, it was living a horror story written by cosmic authors. The enforcer paused its weaving. One of its many limbs, this one ending in something resembling both a hand and a scanning device, extended toward Leon's hiding place. It hadn't turned to look at him, but it knew he was there. The limb hovered, sensors active, analyzing. Leon held perfectly still, his combat instincts screaming at him to attack or flee. But he did neither. He watched. He analyzed. His system interface recorded everything, the enforcer's weaving patterns, the structure of its rule strings, the way it drew power from the narrative coherence of the horror story it enforced. The entity's attention shifted back to its work, apparently deciding Leon wasn't an immediate threat. It resumed weaving, creating new rule strings to replace the ones Leon had disrupted. One new string glowed particularly bright: loophole user detected in Sector 7B, escalation protocol initiated, personalized nightmares TO commence at sunset. Sunset was minutes away. The sky already burned with unnatural oranges and purples, the sun a distorted oval sinking behind buildings that leaned toward it as if in worship. Leon remained in his hiding place, watching the heart of the horror that had claimed his city. The narrative enforcer wove on, its limbs moving in patterns that hurt to follow, its presence a weight on reality itself. Around it, the rule strings formed a cage of narratives from which there seemed no escape, except perhaps through the very loopholes the entity sought to eliminate. The last rays of sunset painted the enforcer in bloody light as full dark gathered. Somewhere in the city, personalized nightmares would be beginning for whoever had been identified as the loophole user. Leon knew they meant him. And he knew the confrontation he'd been conserving energy for would come sooner than he'd planned. The narrative enforcer loomed before Leon, its 3-story height casting a shadow that swallowed the city square. Multiple limbs moved with unsettling grace, each one weaving glitching rule strings into the fabric of reality. The air thickened with cosmic energy, pressing down like a physical weight. Leon could see the strings clearly now, thousands of them, pulsing with malevolent intent, converging at the entity's core like a spider at the center of a web. Sunset painted the sky in bloody oranges and purples, the exact moment the enforcer had promised its escalation. Leon stood his ground, his system interface humming at the edge of his consciousness. Strain, 77%. He'd pushed it too far already with those minor hacks, but retreat wasn't an option. The enforcer's presence was a cancer in this city, and cutting it out was the only way to buy his neighborhood time. The entity didn't speak. It didn't need to. One of its limbs gestured, and the rule strings around Leon twisted. The ground beneath his feet shifted, cobblestones rearranging themselves into a labyrinthine pattern. Walls of shimmering, semi-transparent energy rose from nowhere, boxing him in. The air grew cold, and whispers echoed from the maze's depths, fragments of forgotten taboos and broken promises. Leon recognized the tactic, a personalized nightmare, just like the rule weavers, but on a grander scale. This wasn't just psychological, it was rewriting local reality to trap him physically. He activated his diagnostic suite, the familiar overlay appearing in his vision. Rule strings glowed brighter, their text scrolling too fast for a normal human to read. Maze generation protocol, entity containment subroutine. Shifting geometry, non-Euclidean parameters. Psychological amplification, feedback loop enabled. The enforcer was efficient, its code clean and brutal. Leon's mind raced. Direct combat was useless, this thing wasn't a demon to be slain with a sword. It was a system administrator, and he needed to hack its permissions. A wall of energy surged toward him, humming with lethal intent. Leon dodged, his millennia-honed reflexes saving him by inches. The wall passed, leaving a trail of frost in its wake. He could feel the strain in his muscles, the lingering exhaustion from the rule weaver fight still a dull ache in his bones. But he pushed it aside, focusing on the core of the problem. The enforcer's primary rule string was the key, the one that defined its purpose. He'd seen it in the artifact map, maintains narrative stability in a sign zone. That was its foundation. Without it, the entity would lose coherence. Leon sprinted through the shifting maze, his boots scraping against the ever-changing stones. Another energy wall materialized ahead, and he slid under it, feeling the cold burn through his jacket. The whispers grew louder, now forming coherent threats. You will be assimilated. Your hacks are temporary. The cosmic game masters are watching. He ignored them, his system interface scanning frantically. There, a thick, pulsing string of text that connected directly to the enforcer's core. It glowed with oppressive authority, woven into the entity's very being. He reached it just as the maze tightened, walls closing in from all sides. Leon didn't hesitate. He accessed his system interface's editing function, the strain cost flashing in his mind, estimated mental energy drain, 45%. Confirm edit. It was a massive gamble. That much strain could knock him unconscious or worse, permanently damage his connection to the system. But the alternative was being crushed by this cosmic bureaucracy. His fingers moved through the air, manipulating the glitching text. The original rule read with cold finality, maintains narrative stability in assigned zone. Leon's mind worked, searching for a loophole, a flaw in the logic. He couldn't delete it entirely, the system would reject that as too destabilizing. But he could add a condition, a ridiculous prerequisite that would break the enforcer's functionality. He typed quickly, his thoughts translating into code. Maintains narrative stability in assigned zone only if performing a silly dance. The moment he confirmed the edit, pain exploded behind his eyes. It felt like his skull was splitting open, white-hot needles driving into his brain. His system interface screamed warnings, strain critical, 122%. Overload imminent. Leon staggered, blood trickling from his nose, his vision blurring. The maze walls flickered, losing cohesion as the enforcer's control wavered. He could see the entity through the dissolving energy, its multiple limbs twitching erratically. Then, it happened. The narrative enforcer, a being of cosmic horror designed to enforce deadly taboos, began to move in a jerky, awkward rhythm. One limb lifted, then another, as if pulled by invisible strings. It shifted its weight, its massive form swaying side to side in a clumsy jig. The movement was utterly absurd, a 3-story-tall monstrosity attempting a silly dance while reality glitched around it. Rule strings snapped and fizzled, their light dying out. The maze collapsed entirely, the walls vanishing into motes of fading energy. Leon dropped to one knee, gasping for air. The mental strain was crushing, a weight that threatened to pull him into darkness. He could feel his system interface struggling to stabilize, the 122% strain level causing random error messages to flash in his vision. But he'd done it. The hack had taken. The enforcer didn't stop dancing. It continued its awkward jig, but its roar of fury shattered the momentary silence. The sound was less a noise and more a distortion of reality, vibrating through the ground and making Leon's teeth ache. The entity's multiple eyes, previously focused on weaving rules, now blazed with pure, undiluted rage. It had been humiliated, its core function subverted by a mere loophole user. As Leon watched, struggling to rise, the enforcer's roar triggered something deeper in the cosmic system. From the shadows of nearby buildings, lesser entities emerged, twisted, glitching forms that moved with predatory intent. There were faceless shapes that blurred at the edges, whispering horrors with too many mouths, and skittering things that defied geometry. They converged on the square, not attacking Leon directly yet, but forming a protective circle around the still dancing enforcer. Their rule strings were simpler, more brutal: protect the nexus. Eliminate intruders. Maintain coherence. Leon's system interface flickered, giving him a grim assessment. The hack was destabilizing the enforcer's control over the city, but it wasn't destroyed. And now it had called for reinforcements. The observer-class enforcer was still watching from that distant rooftop, he could feel its too many eyes on him, but these new entities were immediate threats. He counted at least a dozen, each radiating deadly intent. The square, once empty except for him and the enforcer, was now a battlefield. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling. The strain was still there, a constant pressure in his skull, but he couldn't afford to collapse. Not here. Not with the enforcer's fury echoing in the air and lesser entities closing in. He'd won a temporary victory, but the cost was higher than he'd anticipated. And the game was far from over. The air in the city center crackled with the aftermath of Leon's hack, the oppressive cosmic energy of the narrative enforcer now tinged with absurdity as the 3-story-tall entity performed an awkward, jerking dance. But the victory was fleeting. A dozen lesser entities, twisted forms of shadow and glitching geometry, surged forward from the periphery, their movements synchronized by the enforcer's lingering command protocols. They were nameless horrors, each a unique violation of physics, one with too many limbs that moved in impossible angles, another that seemed to be made of fractured mirrors reflecting distorted versions of Leon, a third that oozed darkness that swallowed the faint light of the glitching rule strings overhead. Leon's body screamed in protest. The system strain at 122% felt like molten lead poured directly into his synapses, his vision swimming with phantom text and his nose dripping blood that splattered on the cracked pavement. But 1,000 years in hell had taught him one immutable truth: pain was just another variable to account for. He straightened, wiping the blood with the back of his hand, his combat instincts overriding the mental agony. The lesser entities closed in, forming a tightening circle around him, their forms shifting to exploit the narrative coherence the enforcer had woven into this space. He didn't wait for them to strike. With a burst of motion that belied his exhaustion, Leon lunged at the mirror-fractured entity. His fist, hardened by millennia of demon battles, connected not with glass but with the rule string that defined its existence. His system interface flared in his vision, the diagnostic suite automatically parsing the glitching text as he moved, entity_class, lesser_reflective_horror. Rule, reflects physical attacks with amplified force. Condition, maintains coherence when observed. The words shimmered in his mind's eye, a fragile line of code in the cosmic programming. Even as his knuckles made contact, sending cracks through the mirror-like surface, Leon's other hand moved in a precise gesture, not a punch, but an edit. He focused through the pounding headache, the 15% reduction in strain costs from his upgrade the only thing keeping him conscious. With a mental command, he rewrote the rule, entity_class, lesser_reflective_horror. Rule, reflects physical attacks with amplified force reflects compliments with exaggerated gratitude. Condition, maintains coherence when observed. The change took effect instantly. The entity, which had been rearing back to unleash a shard storm of reflected kinetic energy, suddenly stopped. Its fractured surface smoothed into something resembling a polite smile. "Why, thank you for noticing," it chirped in a discordant, multi-layered voice. "Your punch was truly magnificent in its form. I must say, the follow-through was impeccable." It began bowing repeatedly, each motion causing its form to glitch harmlessly. But there was no time to appreciate the absurdity. The limb-angled horror was upon him, its too many arms striking from directions that defied Euclidean space. Leon ducked and weaved, his body moving on pure muscle memory. Each dodge was calculated not just to avoid the attacks, but to position himself where he could see the rule strings woven into the entity's core. He took a glancing blow to the shoulder, a cold, numbing impact that felt like reality itself rejecting his presence, and used the momentum to spin, his fingers tracing the air as he accessed his interface. The strain ticked up to 124%, a fresh trickle of blood joining the first from his nose. Entity_class, lesser_angular_horror. Rule, attacks bypass conventional physics. Condition, effective within 10 meters of narrative enforcer. He edited it on the fly, his mind racing, entity_class, lesser_angular_horror. Rule, attacks bypass conventional physics attacks must be announced with cheerful slogans. Condition, effective within 10 meters of narrative enforcer. The entity's next strike, a limb that should have pierced Leon's chest from an impossible angle, instead paused midair. "Get ready for a super fun punch," it declared in a sing-song tone, its movements now slow and telegraphed. Leon sidestepped easily, driving his elbow into its central mass. The thing crumpled with a sound like breaking geometry. He was breathing heavily now, each gasp burning in his lungs. The darkness oozing horror slithered closer, tendrils of shadow reaching for his legs. Leon kicked out, not at the entity itself, but at the rule string he could see coiling around it like malevolent ivy. Entity_class, lesser_shadow_assimilator. Rule, assimilates targets through shadow contact. Condition, requires ambient fear to maintain form. He hacked it even as shadow tendrils brushed his ankles, a cold numbness spreading, entity_class, lesser_shadow_assimilator. Rule, assimilates targets through shadow contact offers helpful gardening tips through shadow contact. Condition, requires ambient fear to maintain form. The shadows immediately retracted, reshaping into something resembling a friendly gesture. "Your soil pH seems off," the entity murmured in a whispery voice. "Have you considered adding lime?" One by one, Leon turned the tide through brutal efficiency. He didn't just fight, he reprogrammed the battlefield. A horror that emitted sanity-draining screams became an enthusiastic karaoke singer belting out show tunes. Another that phased through solid matter now had to knock politely and wait for permission. Each hack cost him, the strain climbing to 127%, then 129%, his vision darkening at the edges. But he was clearing a path, his combat skills creating openings for his system manipulations, each punch or kick timed to coincide with a rule edit. Through the chaos, he kept his eyes on the narrative enforcer. The massive entity had stopped its silly dance, its multiple limbs twitching with rage as it watched its lesser minions being turned into parodies of themselves. The rule strings around it vibrated with violent intensity, the cosmic energy thickening the air until it was hard to breathe. Leon knew he couldn't sustain this. He was burning through both physical stamina and system resources at an unsustainable rate. The observer class enforcer was still watching from that distant rooftop. He could feel its too many eyes on him, but it hadn't intervened. Yet. He needed to target the source. As he dispatched the last of the lesser entities, a floating horror that now insisted on reciting baking recipes in iambic pentameter, Leon focused his interface on the enforcer. The primary rule was still hacked, forcing the dance, but the entity had adapted, using secondary command structures to coordinate the attack. Leon's diagnostic suite highlighted a key string, secondary_protocol, entity_cohesion. Rule, all lesser entities within zone obey enforcer's commands. Priority, high. It was woven deeply into the local reality, reinforced by the narrative nexus's dense convergence of rules. Gritting his teeth against the strain that now sat at 131%, Leon reached for that string. His fingers trembled as he made the edit, not just changing a word but restructuring the conditional logic. The effort felt like trying to lift a mountain with his mind. He poured his remaining mental energy into the hack, visualizing the change, secondary_protocol, entity_cohesion. Rule, all lesser entities within zone obey enforcer's commands. All lesser entities within zone obey enforcer's commands only if they rhyme. Priority, high. The effect was immediate and chaotic. The narrative enforcer, sensing the change, roared, a sound that wasn't sound but a distortion of local physics that made the buildings tremble. It issued a command to the remaining functional entities, but the words had to rhyme now. Destroy the loophole user, make him suffer, it bellowed, the forced rhyme making the command sound absurd. The entities hesitated, their programming conflicting. One tried to comply but got stuck on the rhyme scheme. I shall break his lunar roofer, it stammered, confused. Another began attacking a nearby lamppost instead, muttering metal petals as justification. The enforcer tried again, end his life with cosmic strife. This time, a few entities moved toward Leon, but their movements were jerky, uncertain, as if fighting their own code. Leon almost smiled through the pain. Almost. But the cost had been tremendous. The hack had drained another 20% of his mental resources, pushing his system strain to 151%. He staggered, his knees buckling as fresh blood streamed from his nose and now his ears as well. The world tilted, rule strings blurring into meaningless static. He could feel his system interface struggling to maintain coherence, warning messages flashing in his peripheral vision about critical overload. And then the narrative enforcer focused all its attention on him. The massive entity stopped trying to rhyme commands. Instead, it began weaving a new rule string directly targeting Leon, a personalized, brutal piece of cosmic programming. Leon's interface managed to parse it even as it formed, target_specific, loophole_user_designation_Leon. Rule, cannot access or manipulate rule strings for duration, 1 hour. Enforcement, absolute. Override, none. The string solidified, glowing with terrible finality as the enforcer poured its remaining power into the edit. Leon tried to hack it. He reached for his interface, for the familiar sense of text manipulation that had become as natural as breathing. But his mental commands met a wall, a smooth, impenetrable barrier where his system access should be. He could still see the rule strings, their glitching text now taunting him, but he couldn't touch them, couldn't edit them. The lock was complete. The narrative enforcer loomed over him, its multiple limbs rising like the instruments of some terrible orchestra. The silly dance was forgotten now, replaced by pure, focused malice. It had sacrificed narrative stability in its zone. Leon could see the rule strings throughout the city center beginning to unravel without its maintenance, to create this one absolute rule against him. The entity gathered cosmic energy, reality warping around it as it prepared a final assault, a blow that would erase not just his body but his very existence from the narrative. Leon stood alone in the center of the crumbling plaza, his system locked, his body battered, the observer-class enforcer still watching silently from afar as the end approached. The air in the city center crackled with cosmic energy, thick enough to taste like ozone and rust. Leon stood at the center of the plaza, his system interface locked behind a shimmering barrier of glitching text that read, hacking functions disabled, 47 minutes and 32 seconds remaining. The numbers ticked down with agonizing slowness. Before him, the narrative enforcer loomed 3 stories tall, its multiple limbs weaving reality itself into deadly patterns. Each movement left trails of shimmering rule strings that solidified into physical threats. Leon's body remembered the 1,000 years of hell before his mind could process the danger. As the enforcer's first attack manifested, a wave of pavement that rose like teeth to swallow him, he was already moving. His combat reflexes, honed against demons that could phase through dimensions, carried him in a blur of motion. He didn't think, he flowed. The ground shattered where he'd been standing, concrete shards flying like shrapnel. One grazed his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood that mingled with the sweat already soaking his clothes. The enforcer didn't pause. Another limb gestured, and the air itself thickened into invisible walls. Leon felt the pressure before he saw the distortion, a shimmer in the light that signaled reality being rewritten to trap him. He dropped into a roll, his muscles screaming from the strain of the previous battles. The strain gauge in his peripheral vision still read 151%, a constant reminder of how close he was to system failure. But for now, that system was useless. All he had was the body that had survived a millennium of torment. He came up running, his boots pounding against the cracked plaza tiles. The enforcer tracked him with multiple eyes that glowed with cold, cosmic light. Another attack, this time, the shadows themselves reached for him, elongating into grasping hands that whispered with stolen voices. Leon vaulted over a shattered fountain, his hands finding purchase on broken marble. The shadow hands clawed at the stone where he'd been, leaving deep gouges that smoked with unnatural cold. Breathing hard, Leon assessed his situation. The plaza was a battlefield of the enforcer's making. Rule strings hung in the air like spiderwebs, visible only as faint glitches in reality, text fragments that read things like, local gravity increased by 300%, or, all sound muted except entity commands. Normally, he could hack these. Now, they were just obstacles. He dodged another attack, this one rewriting the air into solid crystal that shattered as he passed through the space it had occupied moments before. The enforcer seemed to understand his vulnerability. It pressed the advantage, its weaving limbs moving faster. Reality buckled and twisted around Leon. One moment, the ground was solid, the next, it became liquid shadow that tried to pull him under. He leaped, using chunks of debris as stepping stones. His mind raced even as his body fought. The strain from earlier hacks, the dance command, the rhyme requirement, had left the enforcer's own rule strings glitching. He could see it in the way certain text fragments flickered, showing contradictory commands. Maintain narrative stability, conflicted with, perform silly dance when possible. The entity was fighting its own programming. But seeing the opportunity and exploiting it were different things. Without his system interface, Leon couldn't touch those strings. All he could do was survive until the lock expired. The timer in his vision read 32 minutes and 17 seconds. Half an hour of this. He wasn't sure he had that long. The enforcer changed tactics. Instead of area attacks, it focused on Leon personally. A limb pointed, and a rule string snapped into place. Target's nervous system amplifies pain signals by 1000%. Leon gasped as every existing injury, the cuts, the bruises, the deep muscle fatigue, exploded into white-hot agony. His vision swam. He stumbled, barely avoiding a follow-up attack that would have crushed him. The pain was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to drown his consciousness. He remembered similar torments in hell, demons that could rewrite a victim's perception of suffering. He'd survived those too. Teeth gritted, Leon forced himself to move through the pain. He focused on the rhythm of combat, the dance of survival he knew so well. Dodge, roll, strike when there was an opening. His fists connected with the enforcer's limb once, the impact jarring up his arm. The entity didn't seem to feel it physically, but the attack disrupted its weaving momentarily. The pain amplification rule flickered, giving Leon a second of relief. He used it to put distance between them, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The observer-class enforcer watched from its rooftop perch, too many eyes unblinking. Leon could feel its gaze like a physical weight, but he had no attention to spare for it. The narrative enforcer was his immediate problem. And it was learning. It began combining rules, layering effects that made the battlefield increasingly hostile. Local time dilation, target perceives time at 50% speed, combined with accelerated entity attack patterns. To Leon, the world seemed to slow while the enforcer's movements became a blur. He barely dodged a limb that would have taken his head off, feeling the wind of its passage against his face. Minutes crawled by. The timer read 15 minutes and 42 seconds. Leon's body was reaching its limits. He'd been fighting almost continuously since arriving in the city center, and the strain of earlier hacks had taken a toll even before the physical combat began. Blood trickled from his nose again, a familiar sign of system overload even with functions locked. His muscles trembled with exhaustion. But his eyes remained sharp, watching the enforcer's movements, studying the glitching rule strings that surrounded it. There, a contradiction in the entity's core programming. The dance command he'd implanted was fighting with the narrative stability mandate. Every time the enforcer tried to weave a new rule, its limbs would twitch toward the silly dance motion, disrupting the pattern. The glitches were becoming more frequent, the rule strings flickering like bad neon signs. Leon realized something: the enforcer was trying to repair itself, to overwrite his hacks, but in doing so, it was creating vulnerabilities in its own structure. The timer hit 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Leon didn't think he had 5 minutes. The enforcer, sensing his weakening state, prepared a final assault. All its limbs raised, weaving a complex pattern that made the very air scream with cosmic energy. Rule strings multiplied, layering into a death sentence: spatial collapse, matter disassembly, soul erasure. The plaza darkened as reality itself prepared to unravel around Leon. He had one chance. The glitches in the enforcer's own strings were concentrated around its weaving limbs, the physical interface through which it manipulated rules. If he could disrupt that interface physically, before the final attack completed. Leon charged. Not away from the gathering storm of cosmic energy, but directly toward the enforcer. Pain forgotten, exhaustion pushed aside, he moved with the last reserves of his hell-forged strength. The entity didn't expect the move, its programming assumed a target would flee overwhelming force. For a fraction of a second, it hesitated, its weaving pattern faltering. That was all Leon needed. He reached the base of the towering entity, where multiple limbs converged in a nexus of glowing energy. Rule strings swarmed here like angry bees, text fragments reading, weave, maintain, enforce. And among them, the glitches, dance, rhyme, contradictions that made the whole structure unstable. With a roar that came from 1,000 years of survival, Leon attacked not the entity itself, but its method of control. His hands found two of the weaving limbs where they met at the nexus. He didn't try to break them, they were made of solidified cosmic energy, unbreakable by physical force alone. Instead, he forced them against their natural motion, twisting them into the pattern of the silly dance his hack had imposed. He used the entity's own glitching programming against it, amplifying the contradiction through physical intervention. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The enforcer shuddered, its multiple eyes widening in what might have been surprise. The rule strings around it went wild, flickering through colors that hurt to look at. Text fragments scrambled, maintain, became, main dance, narrative stability, became, narrative silliness. The death sentence it had been weaving unraveled, the spatial collapse reversing in a shower of harmless light. But Leon wasn't done. He could feel the system lock in his interface weakening as the timer approached 0. 3 seconds, 2 seconds. He put everything he had into one final twist of the limbs, forcing them into a recursive pattern, the dance command trying to execute while the stability command tried to stop it, over and over in an infinite loop. The enforcer's form began to glitch. Solid sections of its body pixelated, then reformed, then pixelated again. It made a sound that wasn't a roar but a system error, a screech of corrupted data. The rule strings it had woven throughout the city snapped, one by one. Leon could see them breaking, NO speaking after midnight, dissolved into glittering dust. Do not touch public art, unraveled like old thread. The oppressive cosmic energy that had hung over the plaza began to dissipate. Then the explosion. Not of fire and heat, but of pure information. The narrative enforcer came apart in a burst of glitching fragments, shards of light that contained frozen moments of rules it had enforced. A piece showed a smiling man asking questions. Another showed a faceless figure on a Tuesday. They hung in the air for a moment, beautiful and terrible, before dissolving into nothingness. The plaza fell silent. The observer class enforcer on the rooftop didn't move, but its too many eyes seemed to narrow. Then it vanished, leaving only the impression of having been there. Leon collapsed to his knees. The system lock had expired, his interface rebooting. But instead of the familiar diagnostic suite, a critical message filled his vision, glowing with urgent red text. Alert, higher cosmic horrors detected. Anomaly confirmed, loophole user identified. Narrative rewrite initiated, elimination protocol engaged. Estimated time to manifestation, 72 hours. Then his system went dark, and Leon fell forward into unconsciousness, lying amid the ruins of the plaza as the first true dawn in weeks began to lighten the sky over the newly freed city. Leon's consciousness swam up from a deep, dark ocean. The first sensation was the softness of a pillow beneath his head, followed by the faint scent of lavender and antiseptic. His eyelids felt heavy as lead weights, but he forced them open, blinking against the gentle morning light filtering through half-drawn curtains. He was in his apartment. His own bed. The familiarity of the cream-colored walls and the slightly cracked ceiling plaster should have been comforting, but everything felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, less oppressive than before the battle. Leon tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, forcing him back down with a soft groan. "He's awake," a familiar voice called from the doorway. Henry Miller's face appeared, looking both relieved and anxious. The neighbor who had explained the Tuesday rule about the faceless man now carried a tray with a steaming bowl of soup. His hands trembled slightly as he set it on the bedside table. 3 days, Henry said, his voice hushed as if afraid to break some fragile peace. "You've been out for 3 days, Leon. We thought, well, we didn't know what to think." Leon's throat felt dry as desert sand. "Water," he managed to croak. Sarah appeared with a glass, her expression a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. Her son peeked from behind her legs, the same boy who had laughed for the first time in weeks after Leon's earlier hack. Now the child watched with wide, curious eyes, but without the terror that had haunted them before. "Everyone's been taking shifts," Sarah explained as Leon drank slowly. "Mr. Garrett organized it. After what happened in the city center, after that thing exploded." She trailed off, unable to find words for the cosmic horror that had been defeated. Leon's mind began clearing, the fog of exhaustion lifting enough for him to access his system interface. He focused inward, and the familiar blue holographic display flickered to life in his vision. Warnings flashed, system strain had dropped to 78%, still elevated but no longer critical. His mental energy reserves were at 41% and slowly regenerating. The diagnostic suite showed no permanent damage, just severe exhaustion from pushing his abilities beyond their limits. "What's happening out there?" Leon asked, his voice stronger now. Henry's face lit up with something Leon hadn't seen in any neighbor since his return, genuine hope. "It's quiet. Peaceful, even. No disappearances. No strange rules being enforced. The things that used to watch from the shadows, they're gone." Mr. Garrett shuffled into the room, leaning on his cane. The elderly neighbor's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Haven't slept this well in months," he said. "Woke up this morning and actually remembered my dreams. Used to be just, blank. Like something was eating them." Over the next hour, as Leon regained his strength, the neighbors shared their experiences. The fear that had gripped the city for months had lifted like a fog burning away in sunlight. People ventured outside without checking calendars for taboo days. Children played in the park without adults hovering nervously, waiting for some unknowable rule to be broken. The oppressive silence that had hung over everything had been replaced by the ordinary sounds of life, distant traffic, birdsong, the hum of electricity. But Leon knew better than to trust surface appearances. He pushed himself upright, ignoring the protests of his aching muscles. "I need to see for myself." Sarah helped him to the window. Leon looked out over his neighborhood, and for the first time since returning from hell, he saw color. Literally. The grayscale filter that had tinted everything since the cosmic horror rules took hold was gone. Grass was green, sky was blue, brick walls showed their natural reddish hues. More importantly, when he activated his system interface's rule string visualization, the usual dense web of glitching text that had covered every surface was thinner. Still present, but muted, like background radiation rather than active programming. He focused on a particular rule string that had been etched into the sidewalk across the street. "Third step on Tuesday triggers assimilation." The text was still there, but it flickered weakly, like a dying light bulb. When he probed it with his system, he found it had been downgraded from active enforcement to archived rule. The cost to edit it now showed as minimal, only 2% mental energy where it would have been 15% before. This is a safe zone, Leon murmured, more to himself than to the neighbors. What does that mean? Henry asked, his hope tempered by caution. Leon turned from the window. The narrative enforcer maintained cosmic horror rules in this city. When it was defeated, its control collapsed. But only locally. The rules are still active elsewhere. He spent the next few hours walking the neighborhood with his system interface active, mapping the boundaries of the safe zone. It extended approximately 3 kilometers in every direction from the city center where the final battle had occurred, roughly his entire neighborhood and parts of adjacent districts. Beyond that border, he could see rule strings glowing with full intensity, entities moving in the shadows, the grayscale filter still in effect. But within the safe zone, reality had reverted to something approaching normal. Yet Leon's diagnostic suite kept flagging anomalies. Residual energy signatures from the narrative enforcer's destruction. Faint signals from distant cosmic horrors, not active threats, but monitoring. Watching. And his system's threat assessment module projected with 89% certainty that the safe zone was temporary. The higher cosmic horrors, the game masters, wouldn't leave a loophole like this unaddressed. That evening, Leon gathered the neighbors who had been caring for him in the community center, a modest building that had been mostly unused since the rules took hold. About 20 people showed up, their faces a mixture of hope and lingering trauma. Sarah brought her son. Mr. Garrett sat in the front row. Henry stood near the door, as if ready to flee at any moment. I can't explain everything, Leon began, choosing his words carefully. But the peace we're experiencing has limits. And it won't last forever. A murmur went through the room. The hope in some eyes dimmed. I'm going to teach you how to recognize when the rules are active, Leon continued. Not how to break them, that's beyond what most people can do. But how to see them. How to avoid triggering them. Over the next 2 days, Leon conducted what he privately called Rule Awareness 101. Using his system interface's ability to project simplified visualizations, he showed them patterns, how rule strings tended to cluster around certain locations, how entities moved according to predictable, if bizarre, patterns, how taboos often had visual or auditory cues before they activated. He taught them to notice the grayscale filter, the unnatural silences, the way reality sometimes stuttered when rules were about to engage. He was careful not to reveal the full extent of his abilities. When Sarah asked how he defeated the narrative enforcer, he gave vague answers about finding weaknesses and exploiting contradictions. The neighbors accepted this, they'd seen enough to know some truths were too dangerous to share. On the third morning after waking, Leon stood on his apartment's rooftop as dawn painted the sky in oranges and purples. His system strain had dropped to 62%, his mental energy back to 78%. He'd spent the previous night reinforcing the safe zone's boundaries, using his upgraded system interface to create subtle, rule buffers, minor edits to existing rule strings that would slow any attempted incursion. Each edit cost minimal energy now that the rules were weakened, and his 15% reduction in strain costs for minor manipulations made the work sustainable. He looked toward the border where his neighborhood met the still rule-bound city beyond. The difference was stark. On his side, birds flew in erratic but natural patterns. On the other side, they moved in perfect geometric formations. On his side, clouds drifted, on the other, they hung motionless like painted backdrops. His diagnostic suite pinged with an alert. Anomalous energy spike detected, 47 kilometers east, then another 32 kilometers north. Then a third, directly overhead. Leon looked up. The sky glitched. It wasn't like the minor visual artifacts he'd seen before. This was a full system rewrite. The blue of the morning sky fractured into hexagonal segments, each showing different versions of reality, some with multiple suns, some with no sun at all, some with strange constellations that hurt to look at. Between the hexagons, rule strings scrolled too fast to read, but Leon's system interface captured snippets. Narrative parameters updating. Player designation, loophole user. Escalation protocol engaged. Previous rules deprecated. The entire safe zone shuddered. The grayscale filter flickered back into existence for 3 terrifying seconds before vanishing again. Every rule string Leon had analyzed over the past days suddenly updated, their text rewriting itself into more complex, nested structures with conditional clauses and recursive loops. From the street below, he heard screams. Not the screams of immediate danger, but the scream of hope being torn away. Then the voice came. It didn't come from any direction, but from everywhere at once, from the air, from the ground, from inside his own skull. It was vast and cold and utterly alien, speaking in words that were not words but concepts forced into linguistic shape. The game master has updated the rules. A pause that stretched across eternity. Level 2 begins. The hexagons in the sky snapped back into place, leaving behind a sky that looked normal but felt wrong. The rule strings settled into their new, more complex patterns. And at the very edge of Leon's enhanced perception, he felt them, new entities, more sophisticated than the narrative enforcer, waking up and turning their attention toward the safe zone. Toward him. Leon's system interface flashed a new alert, higher cosmic horror narrative rewrite detected. Elimination protocol estimated time, 69 hours, 42 minutes, 18 seconds. He didn't move from the rooftop. He just watched the sky, his mind already working through possibilities, loopholes, counterhacks. The temporary victory was over. The real game was just beginning.